Hello and welcome to Squatchspot. I'm Darren Smith, and I hope that all of you out there are doing okay and that you and your loved ones are well. Sorry for not posting a video last weekend. However, as I mentioned numerous times previously, this time of year I generally get rather busy, so I'm not spending so much time out in the field conducting field research and creating videos for YouTube. So I definitely encourage you to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you will be notified when I upload future videos. And also this time of year, as I mentioned, I believe the Sasquatch get up to those much higher elevations that are very difficult to access and would require a multi-day trek into the backcountry. So that is something I'm definitely interested in doing this summer. However, at the moment, I have not found the time to do so. However, I am definitely keeping the areas of interest that I've been investigating previously under surveillance, and I'm definitely monitoring them closely. And I've returned to that location where we discovered those interesting footprint impressions from our last episode. Here, take a look. I discovered the trackway while investigating an area I have been monitoring, an area where I have had Sasquatch activity in the past. The footprints were all consistent in size and shape, and were clearly not from a bear. The tracks were measuring a little over 11 inches long, with an average toe width of roughly 5 inches, and a heel width of approximately 4 inches. The step length average, which is the distance between the same point on opposite consecutive footprints, was just over 18 inches long. And the stride length, which is the measurement of the distance between the same spot on two of the same consecutive footprints, was approximately 35 inches. I made a number of plaster casts of the footprint impressions I discovered in the area, and although the casts really did not show any enhanced detail, and the footprint impression measurements and trackway do fall within human range, what I do find compelling, the subject that had made the impressions had moved out of the thick forest and crossed the road. Once doing so, there was an unusual angling noted on the trackway, which to me implied a lack of focus direction or indecision. The right footprint impressions were angled slightly towards a cleared out area. However, steps later they veered back and the subject eventually moved up behind a very large tree that was very close to the road. And the closeness of these impressions to me implies the subject had crouched down behind the tree for a bit before moving off into the forest. Another thing I find very compelling are the measurements taken of the trackway. Though definitely within human capabilities, the average step length and stride of the subject as it moved through the environment was substantial. With the exception of crossing the road, the subject never ventured into open spaces and remained in close proximity to the heavy brush, and coupled with its positioning behind the large tree, to me suggests it was trying to remain hidden or elusive. And taking into consideration the significant evidence I have already obtained in this area and previously noted Sasquatch activity, I am very compelled to believe these footprint impressions did come from a juvenile Sasquatch. So, as I mentioned, at just a little over 11 inches long, these footprints absolutely fall within human range. However, what I do find very intriguing, as I mentioned, is the positioning and angling of these footprint impressions. Whatever made these impressions crossed this road and came up and hid behind this tree behind me. And based on the way the feet were positioned as it crouched down behind the tree, really does lead me to believe that this was a juvenile Sasquatch. And also it stayed in the shadows. It remained very elusive as it moved out of this area. It never ventured into any opened out areas, and it moved into the heavy brush and into the forest. So based on all of the evidence that was present during that investigation, I am very compelled to believe that this could have been a juvenile Sasquatch that left these impressions. So I'm definitely going to be spending quite a bit of time today investigating this environment to see if I can find any more physical evidence that there are Sasquatch in this area. During the initial investigation of this area, I spent a fair amount of time investigating the surrounding areas, looking for any sort of physical evidence that there were other Sasquatch in the area. However, I didn't find any. So I did find it hard to believe that a juvenile Sasquatch was roaming the forest alone. However, I have received some information from some very credible researchers who offer the idea that this juvenile may had already been cast out of the family group. There is a general idea that once the Sasquatch reaches a certain age, and it's usually the male Sasquatch, they are oftentimes cast out of the family group, at which point they are kind of roaming the forest as an individual, kind of looking to start their own clan or a family unit. So it is not out of the realm of possibility that this juvenile Sasquatch had already reached that age of maturity where it was time for it to be kind of out on its own, and that may explain why it was roaming this area alone and why I didn't find any other physical evidence that there were other Sasquatch in the area. And what I do find very intriguing about that theory is we are in an area where I believe the family groups kind of hang out. And so at this point in the season, I would think that the family groups have already moved up towards those higher elevations. And I find it interesting that if this was a juvenile Sasquatch, that it's still kind of hanging out at these lower elevations, kind of near these areas where I absolutely believe the family units are hanging out during those previous seasons. So I am very intrigued by this idea and the theories that were presented to me by other researchers, which is definitely why I made time to come out here and to continue investigating this area. And I will definitely be monitoring it closely, because although we did have a little bit of an increase in temperature around Memorial Day weekend, the temperatures have dropped considerably. In fact, we are at the mid to high 60s at the moment. So it is unseasonably cold this time of year, or this season. So that may also kind of encourage the Sasquatch to remain at these lower elevations a little bit longer. And as I mentioned, we did have a late snow season as well. The snow took a long time to melt off, at which point I thought the Sasquatch would definitely be on their move up to those higher elevations. And another thing that may be contributing to the possibility that there are Sasquatch still at these lower elevations is that with COVID still among us, there are areas that have yet to open up. In fact, a lot of the national forest here is still shut down. And also in Yosemite National Park, they are limiting traffic into that area. So there is definitely a significant decrease in the tourism and the weekend warriors that are coming up into this area. And I think COVID is definitely one of the contributing factors there. So there are a number of possible theories as to why a juvenile Sasquatch would be at these lower elevations. And I'm definitely going to be spending a bit of time today kind of investigating this area to see if I could find any physical evidence that that juvenile is still in the area. I don't know if you could see it behind me there, but there is a very large meadow down in that area. As I mentioned on previous episode, it's very strategic to spend some time up in the forest looking down into these meadows. You want to keep yourself concealed in the forest. And I don't necessarily think the Sasquatch are going to be moving into the meadows. However, they could be hanging out just on the perimeters. So by hanging out in a location kind of keeping those areas under surveillance, you might be able to catch a glimpse of a Sasquatch that is also monitoring those meadows where there's a lot of wildlife that will venture into those areas. Wildlife that is definitely food sources for the Sasquatch. So I've mentioned this on a previous episode, but I think the Sasquatch are using this buckbrush, the brush that has that very sharp needle-like thorns, as a way to kind of create a perimeter around them to protect them. And so I spend a lot of time in areas where I see game trails that are leading through the buckbrush, and also areas that are cleared out behind the buckbrush, because after discovering that nest, I think it was very strategic that the Sasquatch located that nest that was completely surrounded by the buckbrush, because it made an impenetrable wall around their nest site, with the exception of the areas that were cleared out. So I definitely spend a lot of time investigating these areas around the buckbrush, because I do think the Sasquatch are using the buckbrush as a way to protect themselves. So I've spent a considerable amount of time investigating this area. However, I haven't found any sort of physical evidence that leads me to believe that the juvenile Sasquatch is still in the area, or that there were other Sasquatch present during that initial discovery that we made on the previous episode there. However, I have found numerous footprint impressions in the area and ground disturbances. However, based on the weathering of these impressions, I do think they are from the original trackway that we had discovered previously. So I am very intrigued that a juvenile Sasquatch would be moving through the forest alone, and there are a number of theories that can explain that. And I also find it curious that the Sasquatch is still at these lower elevations. However, I do have some ideas about why it may be kind of hanging out in this particular area. So I am definitely going to be keeping this area under surveillance, and I'll be monitoring it closely in the weeks to come. However, at this point, I really want to get up to those higher elevations to kind of investigate some areas up there where I believe the family units are located, because there is definitely some weather pulling into the area, and I really think it is important we kind of get a move on here. So I am going to cut the investigation of this area short, just to give us some time to get up to those higher elevations and investigate those other areas of interest. I've moved up to a much higher elevation, and I'm investigating another ridgeline of interest, and I'm going to turn the camera around for you so you can kind of see the environment that I find myself in. An environment that was greatly affected by the Creek Fire of 2020. I've mentioned this numerous times on previous videos. However, here in the California Sierra Nevada mountains, we have had an incredible amount of devastation caused by fire. And unfortunately, it's not only the creek fire. So I've come up into this area to investigate the area and to see what sort of impact the creek fire had on this forest habitat, because I absolutely believe the Sasquatch are going to avoid moving into these burnt out zones. So I'm looking for any sort of forest corridors that move through the area that were untouched by the fire, and I'm also investigating where the borders of the fires are, because it's really going to help me identify areas that the Sasquatch are going to avoid and corridors that the Sasquatch may be moving through and making their seasonal migration up to those higher elevations. The Creek Fire is the fourth largest wildfire in California's modern history. It began on September 4th, 2020, near Shaver Lake, California, and driven by powerful winds and a surplus of fire fuels, mostly as a result of the tens of millions of dead trees in the forest caused by drought and the devastation caused by the pine beetle infestation. The fire grew to an enormous size within days and raged for months, destroying over 856 homes and buildings and scorching over 379,895 acres of forest lands before firefighters were able to fully contain the fire on December 24th, 2020. No fatalities to human life were reported. However, the destruction caused to the forest communities is absolutely heartbreaking, and the total financial cost is still unknown. However, the fire suppressant cost alone totaled over $193 million, and the devastation caused to the forest habitats and local wildlife is immeasurable. Habitat that is also home to the Sasquatch. When you're investigating these areas, you absolutely have to be aware of the status of the area that you're investigating, and you should never move into these burnt out zones because there are some hazards that could be present that could be potentially life-threatening, and you definitely want to be well aware of your surroundings, especially these trees that are burnt, and if you are in high wind conditions, these trees can absolutely come down on you. So you have to use extreme caution when you are investigating these areas, and you really have to stay on solid ground away from these burnt out trees and off of this burnt out ground. I continued my investigation of this area affected by the creek fire, and I did take note of a few areas and corridors that were untouched by the fire, areas that will allow the Sasquatch movement through the region without having to move through the burnt out zones. With the storm approaching, I decided it was best to leave the area and get off the mountain, and it was a good thing I got moving, because on my way out, I discovered a fresh tree fall blocking the road I had driven in on, and it took quite a bit of time to clear. Though the area where I discovered the 11-inch footprints is at a lower elevation, I am very compelled to believe these impressions had come from a juvenile Sasquatch, and the trackway and ground disturbances I discovered today near a log and up against the buckbrush adds to my intrigue. I do believe the Sasquatch utilized the buckbrush as a safety measure. It creates an impenetrable barrier of needle-sharp thorns, which does offer the Sasquatch protection, and discovering the Sasquatch nest site in 2020 that was surrounded by this brush, I believe adds a lot of support to this theory. Also, what I'm very intrigued by are the theories the juvenile Sasquatch that is roaming this area may have been cast out of its family group or clan and is roaming the woods alone. And if this is the case, I do believe I understand why the juvenile is hanging out at this lower elevation. The location is an area I strongly believe the family groups reside during the winter months, and since we had a late snows thaw this year, and the temperatures are unseasonably cool, the juvenile may not realize it is time for it to move up to those higher elevations, or perhaps it is choosing to stay at these lower elevations. Regardless, it is here. Granted, this is all speculation, however I am intrigued by the possibilities, and I am going to continue to monitor this area closely, and I am making plans to get up to those higher elevations where I believe the Sasquatch family groups are residing during the summer months. I want to thank you all again for your continued support of my channel, and I welcome you to join my Squatchspot Facebook group, where I connect with followers on a more personal level. I will leave a link in the description below. And until next time, I'm Darren Smith, and I'll see you here at Squatchspot.